Hi everyone! So this is just a quick video taking you through the answers for the questions on worksheets 9 and 10. So if you recall, worksheet 8 or lesson number 8 was the one where the romantic period was introduced, and I took you through the features of romanticism in music using the Mad T-shirt mnemonic, and worksheet 8 was done very well. Basically, you were just lifting information directly from the video and putting it onto the worksheet and just sort of organising it in that Mad T-shirt format. Worksheet 9, if you recall, had two little listening questions at the that you had to do at the end of the video, and then worksheet 10 was our first revision worksheet where you had to do sort of more substantial questions. So this video I'm going to go through the answers. I have obviously marked these and made a note of the areas that you are maybe not as clear on and what was answered well and stuff, but I thought it was easiest for me to just show you these answers so that you can go back, please, and check against what you got. I don't have a printer at the moment, so I can't print off what you've sent me, mark it physically, and then rescan it and send it back. So I need you to look back at what you put and follow through these answers, but I have made a note of how you've done, and will send this video along with some feedback for you directly. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is look at the two questions on worksheet number 9. Okay, so on worksheet number 9, you had two appraisal questions, and it says each extract will be played twice on the video with a pause warning in between. But I did say that you could pause longer to give you time to write down your answers. We need to strike the balance between getting all this information into our heads and sort of taking our time to respond and sort of formulate our thoughts, but then also you do need to be practicing doing things in exam conditions because there is a time pressure when you come to the real thing. You do actually always have an extract played 3 times as a minimum, and you will get it 4 times when there's a comparison question, so when you're comparing 2 extracts, and also when you have to do that longer paragraph question. You get it 4 times. But for this one, because these were very short extracts and the questions were all pretty simple, I thought you only had it twice. I did say that I wanted you to read the questions through before you listened, and you do get that on the exam, so that's getting into the way of how it is on an exam. So you've got the questions in your head and in your mind before you listen. What's the solo instrument in this concerto? And you could probably anticipate that because we've been looking at the romantic period, I was going to give you a romantic example. You therefore know that you can only have a violin, a cello, or a piano. So that's narrowing it down. And it's going to be fairly obvious out of those 3 if it's a piano. So what you've got to think is, how am I going to tell the difference between a cello and a violin? And some of you have struggled with that. So when a cello is playing very high or a violin is playing very low, that can be complicated. So you've got to, as you hear that question, you've got to think, okay, I'm going to be listening out for the pitch of this instrument, because if it's string, I need to determine whether it fits into the cello pitch range or the violin pitch range. So you're listening out for an ornament in the first phrase, and this ornament was also repeated. Again, I have told you which ornaments were more popular. You've been told that the trill was the most popular and that also mordants were used quite commonly. So you're going to be anticipating that. Tempo should be fairly obvious what the tempo is. Obviously, I hope we can all ascertain if something's slow or fast, but then you've got to be thinking about your tempo terms. So even when you're having the questions read out and your mind's sort of clear and you're not focusing on the music yet, you could be thinking, okay, well, what are the ones that I've remembered? Moderato in the middle, allegro fast, largo slow. You've got to think what you've got so that you can just pick it and move on quickly. On this basis, what movement is it likely to be from? So you're thinking fast, movement 1 or movement 3, slow, movement 2. That's prior knowledge. 2 words which best describe the melody's articulation and contour: disjunct, legato, accented, conjunct, staccato, triadic. So thinking about the meanings of those words and anticipating that. And then this piece has got quite short and balanced phrases. Explain why this means it's more likely to be from the early romantic period rather than late. So that one you can answer before you've listened to the music, and I would suggest you do that, or you leave it until at the end of the extract, where you'll have about a minute pause before moving on to the next the next big question, and you use that time to answer that, because you don't need to be listening for that answer. So the answer for that, which was answered well on what you guys wrote, in the early Romantic, there were obviously still features of classicism that were being used in compositions, and short, balanced phrases were very popular in the classical period. So the reason why this piece has them, and that tells us it's more likely to be from the early Romantic, is because they are a sign of classicism, and that aesthetic was still being used in the early Romantic period. Whereas as you got further into the Romantic period, as you went later on, the melodies got much more complex and long. So obviously you've not got that much space to write an answer. What I was looking for was a reference to the fact that short and balanced phrases were from the classical period, and that came before the Romantic. So in the early Romantic, you would still have some of those features being used. Okay, so we're now going to listen and listen out for the answers to questions 1 to 5. So I'm immediately thinking that's a string. That's my ornament. So that was a trill. So the answer to number 2 is a trill. Tempo, this should be fairly obvious. So the pulse, da, 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 da. Bit of rubato there, so it was quite difficult to click in time. So it's a slow tempo. So the term I would use would be largo, because this is very slow, quite solemn sounding. There's the trill again. On this basis, therefore, it's from the second movement, because it's the slow one. And the 2 words, it's very legato. And it's a bit more disjunct at this point, but certainly the main melody at the beginning was very conjunct. It was moving by step. It was very simplistic. I'm now going back to think about what the solo instrument is. And it's not gone particularly high or particularly low. So I'm going to have to make an educated guess. I'm sort of closing my eyes and imagining what instrument I can see playing that. And I believe it's a low violin, which is the correct answer. So it's a violin, but it is on the low side. So that was a slightly tricky one. But the other questions I think were fairly easy. So the ornament was a trill, the tempo term, largo. If you put adagio, you'd probably get a mark on the exam, but it's not quite right. Adagio tends to be a little bit faster than that. When it's something that's really slow, that's really pulling, I could bet when I was clicking, it was just, it's so sort of heavy sounding. That's a really good sort of indication that it's a largo. Largo was very heavy and very solemn and very slow. So yeah, movement 2, that's an easy question if you know your knowledge, if you've got your prior knowledge in place. Legato and conjunct, it's definitely not accented, it's definitely not staccato, it's not triadic, it's not moving up in triads. There were some leaps, but generally speaking, it was very stepwise. Da 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 like there's that first little leap, da da, but the rest of it, da 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 da, like there's lots and lots of stepwise movements, so I would say conjunct. Okay, so those are the answers for extract 1 questions. Okay, so extract 2, and I've told you I want you to read the questions beforehand. You're being told this is a piano concerto. Okay, brilliant. The extract begins just at the end of the piano solo section. So that means if the piano's been doing a solo, I'm now expecting to hear the orchestra doing something, maybe without the piano, or the piano taking a sort of back seat. What's the first orchestral solo instrument we hear? Okay, so we're in the Romantic period. We know that we had more common orchestral solos. Now, this question wasn't answered very well. Quite a few of you put piano That's not the right answer, because that's not an orchestral solo instrument. When we say orchestral solo instrument, we mean an instrument sitting in the orchestra at the back. And in the Romantic period, it was common for those instruments, particularly woodwind instruments, to have little solos within the piece. So the pianist at the front, who is the main soloist, will be either doing something that's more of an accompanying role, or will be just having a moment's rest. You know, we'll have rests for a few bars whilst we hear some more stuff going on in the orchestra. So you've got to really make sure that you understand that when we talk about an orchestral solo instrument, we mean an instrument in the orchestra at the back. What's the first one that we hear? And then number 2, name a second woodwind instrument we hear after this doing a short solo. So basically, we're going to have some solos in the orchestra. We want to name the first one that we hear, and then we want to name the second. And I deliberately worded it like this to give you a clue, because I said name a second woodwind instrument. So I'm telling you that the answer to number 1 is a woodwind as well. So we have 2 woodwind solos. Actually, there were 3 instruments that you can hear, and I'll talk you through them. So there were 3, but there were 2 questions. So it gives you some options. Question number 3, after the piano soloist returns, the left hand and the bassoon begin to play detached notes. What term would be used to describe this articulation? So we know that detached notes are called staccato. So that is a question that you can answer straight away, even when you're reading through the questions before the extract has begun or at the end. I mean, it doesn't take very long to write staccato. Make sure you spell it correctly, which is 2 C's. So S-T-A-C-C-A-T-O. This is followed by a section at the end of the extract of thin texture. What's the playing technique used by the string family here? So I'm going to be listening out for whether it's arco using bows or whether it's pizzicato. And then give a dynamic marking for the end of the extract. So at the end, I've got to really concentrate on establishing the playing technique for the strings and then a dynamic. And I've got to really concentrate at the start for the orchestral instrument solos. And then I maybe can sort of give my brain a slight rest in the middle. Because for question 3, I don't actually need to be listening. I know it from my prior knowledge. So let's have a listen. Listening for the first woodwind instruments that we hear playing solos. They're not the main piano soloist. So that's the end of the piano solo. That is a clarinet. And that's taken over by a flute. And there is a bassoon underneath them, playing a little counter melody. Okay, so that first orchestral solo, some of you put oboe, go back and listen to it again if you did that. That is a clarinet. It is it's not ringing, it's got that sort of honky breathiness to it. And then the exact same melody with a slight change at the end is imitated by a flute. So the second woodwind instrument doing a short solo, you could say flute, but then also you had a bassoon playing a sort of counter melody that was held on and had moving notes in the gaps between what the clarinet and then what the flute were playing. So that's still a solo, it's still, you know, even though it's a counter melody, it's still very prominent, and it's there within the orchestra. So the answer to question 1 was clarinet, and you have to put clarinet for that. For number 2, you would get a mark for either saying flute or for saying bassoon, and you would not get a mark for saying recorder, because obviously we don't have recorders in the Romantic period. Let me just play that again from the beginning so that you can try to really hear the clarinet sound. Let me try and get it in the right place. Oh, that's the end of extract 1, hold on. Okay, here we go. This is extract 2. Just listen to the start of the clarinet. So the extract begins just at the end of a piano solo. You've just heard the end of that. Listen to the bassoon. Now the flute's taken over. Bassoon does a little bit again. And now they play together. And the strings are playing as well at that point. Let's keep going. So this is all orchestral stuff. I can't hear a piano. So the piano soloist returns. So I'm at question 3 now. Nice trill. I can hear the bassoon and the left hand of the piano playing my staccato notes. I think this is question 4. So that is pizzicato strings. The whole string family are playing pizzicato. Can you hear those really short plucked notes? Okay, so dynamic marking for the end of the extract. Now, even though there was a sort of a slightly louder chord at the end, overall, if you think about the fact that that is an orchestra with, I don't know, at least 50 people sitting there playing instruments, even though it sounded slightly louder, that final chord, individually they're all going to be playing very quietly, and generally the whole extract was quiet. So the dynamic marking you should have put was P or MP. So P is piano, MP is mezzo piano, which means that, you know, a little bit louder than quiet, but still pretty quiet. I don't think you get a mark for putting pianissimo or 2 Ps, because it wasn't, you know, that's exceptionally quiet, where, you know, it's really, really quiet. P or MP would get you the mark. So number 4 was pizzicato, and yet number 1 clarinet, number 2 flute or bassoon would get you the mark, and it would just be 1 mark, that question. Okay, so I hope that has made sense going through those romantic examples for worksheet 9. Okay, so we're now on worksheet 10, and this was a bit more of a formal assessment. I've given you the marks that you could get for each extract, so the 3 questions in total. And these are realistic marks for the type of question you would get on your GCSE exam. And they're also the types of question that will come up. So the way they're worded, the use of wording, the use of how the sentence is put together, what terms they put in. And I'm doing all of this to prepare you for the exam, and that's why it's so important that the words you use and the terms you use and the way you structure your answers, you follow my advice and guidance, because that is how you get the marks. It is unfortunately a bit of a sort of box ticking exercise to make sure that we say the right thing that enabled us to get the marks we deserve. So extract 1, we're going to read through, as always, the questions beforehand. I've got to name the solo instrument. So I'm listing out for my solo instrument, got to name it, really important. 3 instruments in the accompanying orchestra. Now, in every period, Baroque, classical, romantic, you are going to have strings. And within those strings, you will have violins and cellos. In every single one, if you think about it. So the Baroque orchestra, even though it was small, it would always have strings. And so there'd always be, even if it was just, I don't know, it was a really early Baroque orchestra and it had 2 violins and 1 cello, for example. Right the way through to the romantic, you're always going to have a string family. So to be honest, I would put down violin and cello immediately, and then I'm just listing for a third. If I'm going to determine, which is obviously really important that you do this, what period it's from and it's Baroque, I know that there's got to be a harpsichord because we've got our basso continuo. If it's classical, I know that I'm going to have a certain number of woodwind instruments within my orchestra. I'd probably pick something that was relatively clear on the extract, but you could have a string-dominated classical orchestra, so that might be slightly harder. I suppose you could put violas, because you'd almost certainly have violas. And then for the romantic period, I'm probably going to have more options. But yeah, if you put violin and cello, because those are in all of them. So what's really actually important here is that as early as possible, we ascertain what period this concerto extract is from. Name an ornament. We hear the soloist play. I've just seen that I did a typo on the sheet. Ornament. Sorry. Bonus challenge question. What's the second ornament? And I've spelled it right that time. Brilliant. So we're just going to be listening out for an ornament, and we're listening to the soloist closely anyway, because we're trying to name what the instrument is. So we've also got to write down the ornament, and again, we know which ones were more popular. 3 words that best describe the music. So we've got polyphonic, which is to do with texture. We've got melody-dominated homophony, which is to do with texture. Imitation is sort of linked to texture in a way, I suppose. We've got adagio and presto, which are our tempo terms. Virtuosic means you've got a solo part that is very, very difficult and very, very impressive. And then we've got staccato and legato, which are articulation terms. So we're going to have to listen carefully to pick the best three. And then for F, G and H, these are all contextual. As I said, it's important that we ascertain what period it's from, and then we've got name the period, suggest a composer, what type of venue. Make sure if it says suggest which period, you don't put a date. You write Baroque, Classical, Romantic. One or two of you got that wrong. So you actually put the dates correctly, but you didn't say the period. It will say suggest a date this might have been written, or suggest which period this was written in or this is from. Okay, so we're going to start listening. So I'm really concentrating on my solo instrument and also deciding what period I am in as quickly as possible. Okay, so hopefully, and most of you did get it right, hopefully it was fairly clear that that was a beautiful oboe being played. It's got that ringing, very pure, very strong tone. I'm listening to that. I think I can hear a harpsichord in the orchestra. There is a slight wiry timbre that's kind of a bit clunky underneath the strings. I don't think I can hear any other families of instruments other than strings, and it doesn't sound like a particularly big orchestra. What's slightly throwing me off is that in that the accompaniment is very chordal and quite simplistic. So the strings are just going bum 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 bum. It's triadic. So it's not quite as sort of fussy and complicated and interweaving as I would expect for Baroque, but I do think I can hear a harpsichord, and remember that a harpsichord trumps everything else. If I look at my question E, 3 words, well, I've just said this, it's melody-dominated homophony because I can hear this sort of chordal, quite simplistic accompaniment with broken chords, and then there's one very clear soloist over the top. I'm also going to circle adagio because it's not presto, it's not very, very fast, obviously, it's slow. And I think I could, on that first listen, I could circle legato as well because it's very smooth, it's very joined up. So I've been able to answer question E. In terms of the ornament, I did hear a trill, and all of you got that. I can't answer F, G and H quite yet. I want to keep just trying to decide whether I can hear a harpsichord. Let's keep listening. On the first beat of the bar, I think I can hear that clunk. Another trill. Oh, the bit where it just went da, 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 da. That is a turn. So the bonus challenge question, it was a turn. Another trill. Okay, and I've come to the end. So I've got to the end of the extract. I didn't hit any other instruments. It was just strings. And I also, that oboe melody, it was actually, even though it's melody-dominated homophony, that was a very long melody. It just sort of kept going on and it was quite twiddly. So even though it's slow and it's not overly fussy, it was quite elaborate, the oboe melody. It wasn't in short, little neat question and then an answer phrasing. It's an oboe, it's not a clarinet, and I definitely didn't hear clarinets, didn't hear any brass, didn't hear, you know, I'm going to go for Baroque. So therefore, for A, I've put my oboe. For B, I'm going to add harpsichord for my accompanying orchestra. So you should have had violin, cello, harpsichord. C, it was a trill. D, there was a turn, but there were 3 trills in the extract, so you should have got trill. E, as I've already said, I'm going to go with legato, adagio, and melody-dominated homophony. I did that deliberately, that one, because polyphony, or a polyphonic texture, was popular in the Baroque period, but it's not an exclusive feature. And that was the whole point of this video, was to look at what features are exclusive, but which ones you can't rely on. So I was expecting more of you to be confused by the fact that that was melody-dominated homophony and then think it was classical. It wasn't classical, it was Baroque. So F, Baroque, G, Bach, B-A-C-H, H, a palace, a king's court, a wealthy person's house in a large room, something along those lines. So those are the answers for extract 1. Okay, so for this question, for extract 2, which was the columns, the grid, I just wanted you to get back into the sort of zone of practicing doing these. And I didn't want you to write up the final paragraph, because I actually think that that's almost an easier thing to do than making the columns, because it's making the columns where you're actually appraising the music and analysing what you're hearing and what column it fits into. Putting that into full sentences, you all should be capable of writing full sentences with capital letters and full stops. Yes, there are certain things to consider, like you have to make sure you've referred and linked back to the genre at least once, and you have to make sure that you show chronology by, you know, starting your paragraph by saying, at the start we hear blah, blah, blah. But those are all just quite little things. The actual musical skill and appraisal skill is about what you put on those columns. So I just wanted you to do the columns. And generally, I thought this was done okay. You haven't done it for a while. We didn't go into as much detail, some of you, as you could have done. So what I'm going to do is take you through it. So I've done it, but typed. And I'm going to talk you through what I wrote down on each playing. And I do find it quite difficult to stick to one column, and you don't have to, you know, it's not illegal to note something down quickly in a different column for when you come back to it. But the main purpose is that you don't miss out any instruments on the first playing. That's the key thing. It's that you don't spend time in a different column and therefore miss something out. So that's why I say that. If you've got time to quickly scribble a word down in one of the, you know, column 2 or column 3, the middle and the last column on the right, whilst you're listening and you're not missing instruments, then that's obviously fine. So I'm going to show you what I put on my first playing. So you can say it was mainly the instrument column, but I did also put a few things in on the others, just as a kind of reminder. And I'm going to play it now, so I can talk you through these. So we had a tutti chord, then this is violin, and I wrote down that it was solo, just to remind myself. I can now hear the orchestra, and what stands out to me is woodwind. I can hear clarinets, and now I can hear that the violin solo has come back, and it's very high. I've just put that down to remind myself. This seems like a new section. So if you listen to the orchestra, they're playing that theme, and the violin's doing sort of arpeggio thingies over the top. So try and listen to the orchestra playing that theme, or the main melody, the main tune. But now, as I've said, at the bottom of that which column, the violin is sort of more melodic. It's still got extra notes, but it was sort of more melodic and sort of took the melody back a bit. So that's what I got on my first playing. Okay, this in pink is what I got on my second playing. So I'll play it again. So I was really trying to concentrate on the how. So it was loud at the start, accented, obviously, that chord. And I've put the violins playing fast moving notes. And then a trill. And if you listen, they're still playing the trill, but quietly. The orchestral solos, that was wind dominated and legato. And now on the violin solo, I've added lots of vibrato, same melody but higher. And there were some picks in the orchestra underneath. So I've said the orchestra's playing something minor, legato and string dominated. And I've said that the violin arpeggio thingies are very virtuosic. That's quite hard to play that. Not much else to say. I've forgotten really to talk about dynamics. It's sort of MP. And now this is the final bit, so it plays the melody but lots of extra notes. These are called auxiliary notes for anyone that's interested, but that's A level. So that's A level, we talk about auxiliary notes. So it's like passing notes, but they're not passing between steps. They're where you sort of jump away from the melody and embellish it. And it was still pretty high in vibrato. Yeah, I haven't talked about dynamics that much. It had that loud accented chord at the start. Bear in mind you get a rest in between playing. So at that point I possibly would have gone back and tried to put some more dynamics. So I think that final section, there was a bit of a crescendo towards that final bit where the violin sort of took back the melody. It was a bit louder, but generally there weren't significant dynamic contrasts, I don't think. When the violin at the start, when it had its little solo and then did the trill, that then went very quiet when the rest of the orchestra came in with a sort of prominent wind bit. So I might add that when I put my type up, or write up into a paragraph, which obviously you would normally be doing, but you didn't have to do for this. So the third time through, I just was sort of consolidating, really, making sure I'd pop some stuff in the what column. But I'd already put that it was a solo at the start. You see, that does go quite quiet there. And it is crescendoing, actually, so I would add that on. It's still quite quiet. Yes, that was the main theme, and then the violins repeated it. So I've just written, yeah, repeated melody. And then again, here it is in the minor key, we've got the theme again. And the violin is sort of doing a counter melody. I've called it accompanying waffle. I wouldn't suggest you put that on your actual final paragraph in your exam. It's very triadic, lots of arpeggio stuff. And now this is the final section, so this is louder. And the violin has got that melody, that main theme. And then I've just put a little note, themes are being passed around, which was typical in the Romantic period. So you've got your orchestral solos, but you've also got the idea of these themes sort of moving about different groups of instruments within the orchestra. So that relationship between soloist and orchestra in the Romantic period was much stronger. It was much more of a sort of cohesive relationship between the two and much more equal and sort of pushing and pulling between them. So those are all the things that I think you should put on it. And what I'll do now is I'll actually add in a different colour those extra things that I sort of would have thrown in when I started writing it up and realised that I'd missed a few things out and that I could have gone into a bit more detail about dynamics. Okay, so the final question is extract 3. I'm going to read out my questions. A, name the solo instrument for this concerto. Well, that's a pretty standard one that you're going to be asked. B, this is a longer question, I've noticed. It's got 6 marks. Describe the accompaniment in this extract. Refer to those features of the accompaniment which were typical of this period. Okay, so since they changed the specification a couple of years ago, they have added this in. There has been on every paper a 6-mark question that's sort of chucked in on a sort of longer question that's got other, 1 mark, 2 mark questions to it. And then you've just got this 6-mark sort of chunk to do. So this is in addition to your question 3, which is the long paragraph that's worth 9 marks. So that's what you've just been doing your preparatory columns for the extract 2. So that's always question number 3. And then question 6, it's been the last few papers, I think. So further on towards the end of the exam, you have an extract and you've got some shorter little questions worth 1 or 2 marks, but then you will have this longer one. And I think last year's was about the accompaniment. I think the year before it was also about the accompaniment. I'll check that. So that's why I put this in, because it's one that has definitely come up and we need to practice being able to analyse and appraise an accompaniment without doing the whole thing where we have the columns and we do the which instrument, what's it playing, how's it playing, etc. So when it's saying refer to those features of the accompaniment which were typical, what that means is that you've got to use terminology that shows that you understand what period you're in. And we're going to have to work out the period anyway, because you always do. So what you've got to think about, okay, accompaniments. What do I know about accompaniments? If it's Baroque, I'm going to hear a harpsichord, which I can put down because I'm describing the accompaniment. So you're going to talk about the instruments, but you've also got to say what they're doing and how they're doing it. Okay, so I'm anticipating if it's Baroque, there's going to be a harpsichord. I've got to use the term basso continuo because that is showing that I understand what was typical of the period. It's using a period appropriate term. And I'm going to be listening to what the harpsichord is doing. So is it doing very elaborate ornamented stuff that's improvised? Is it playing quite a simple chordal accompaniment? There's going to be a cello with it if it's Baroque as part of the basso continuo. So maybe is the cello doing pizzicato notes, for example? I mean, it's quite unlikely in Baroque, but possible. Are they playing something that's particularly unique or interesting in terms of melody? Okay, classical period features, I'm going to be thinking, right, well, it's probably going to be quite simplistic and balanced and ordered. Am I going to hear Alberti bass, which is the most popular, but then also a different type of broken chord? Am I hearing block chords? Am I going to have arpeggios possibly in the accompaniment? What instruments are going to be prominent? Those are things you're going to be thinking about with classical. And romantic. Okay, romantic accompaniments, well, that, there's lots of options. It was very expressive. Lots of different things could be doing. Might be some quite interesting dynamic changes in the accompaniment, or maybe I might have quite sparse accompaniment if the soloist is very prominent. Again, articulation, so maybe I might have some pizzicato. There might be a timpani roll, specific instruments. One thing that I'm going to be thinking about for the accompaniment, if it's romantic, so I'm second guessing here, if this is a romantic extract I'm about to listen to, in the accompaniment or the accompanying orchestra, it's likely there will be instrumental soloists. So I'm going to need to pick those out. There are soloists. There are solos in the orchestra played by the, whatever. So that's what I'm anticipating, but I don't know yet. So that's why you've got to have all this prior knowledge in your head. C, what term would you use to describe the phrasing of the solo instrument melodies? Well, that's interesting because we don't really have a phrase to describe, we don't really have a term to describe the phrasing of Baroque melodies. Like, they generally were pretty long and kind of unfurling and twiddly and complex, but those aren't musical terms. It's not like a specific term. And the same for romantic. Like, they could be quite short, they could be quite long, they would change a lot. They'd be irregular phrase lengths because the mood would change so frequently in romantic music. So really, question C is suggesting fairly strongly that I'm about to hear a classical extract, because my classical phrasing is periodic phrasing or balanced phrasing or question and answer. Any of those would get you the mark. Suggest a date, suggest a composer. So again, once I know the period, I can answer those questions. And make sure if it says suggest a date, do not write down Baroque, classical or romantic. Don't write that word. That's the period. The date, it wants an actual date. It wants you to say, 1645. Some of you wrote the full span of dates for this. So you wrote 1700 to 1800. You have to actually just pick a date. And if your date is in the right period, the examiner will give you the mark, but you can't write the full span. Okay, just bear that in mind. Right, let's listen to it. So I'm listening out for my soloist, but what I've got to really do is concentrate on my accompaniment. And because there's 6 marks up for grabs, it's likely that the accompaniment is going to change. It's not going to be exactly the same all the way through. So I need to be able to say, at the start, we hear blah, 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 then it does this, then it does this. And I've got to try and go into as much detail as I can, not just saying what the instruments are, what are they doing. And I've got to show how it's typical. Off we go. Okay, so that is a flute. I was quite surprised for this one because a lot of you didn't get that right. So if you didn't, you are not alone. A few of you put clarinet. It's not a clarinet, it's too breathy. it's, you know, I know clarinets are breathier than oboes, but this is taking breathiness to a new level. It's just the tone of it. I don't know. I think, you know, if you're struggling to identify a flute, I think the flute is quite, it's one of the easier ones to pick out. But that's me personally, you know, everybody's different. But I think flutes, you need to practice that. You need to go and listen to some music written for flutes and really try and get that sound into your head, because it should be an easier one. It should be an easier mark to get. Okay, my accompaniment. So the first thing I noticed was that I had repeated chords, which was string dominated. I just had jun, 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 jun chords being played underneath the flute. I'm going to keep listening. The first thing I would write down is repeated chords in the strings. Can you hear those repeated chords? But in that legato passage where the flute goes da, 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 the accompanying orchestra, which again is still string dominated, I can't hear any brass, I don't think I can hear woodwind either, maybe they are playing quite lightly. They also, they sort of play in harmony with the flute, with the soloist. So I would say I want there to be some reference to the fact that we've got repeated chords, block chords. You could say play piano, and you'd get a mark for that. So the fact that there are repeated chords, and then you'd also get a mark for reference to the fact that it's the string family or string dominated. You might also get a mark for saying they're being played very quietly, although the whole piece is quiet at the moment, so that's not really a unique feature of the accompaniment. The whole piece is quiet. But then also you would get a mark for saying that the accompanying orchestra plays in harmony that little legato passage that the flute plays. So I would write sentence 1, the accompaniment is string dominated, starts by playing repeated block chords quietly, then plays in harmony the little melodic passage with the flute soloist. Let's keep listening and see what happens next. We've got 6 marks. That's probably only going to have got me, I don't know, 3 or 4 marks so far. Plump, 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 plump. So can you hear there? We've got some pizzicato lower strings. It's going plump, chunk, 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 plump, chunk, chunk, chunk. So I would say we've got lower pizzicato strings on the first beat of the bar, followed by repeated chords. So I am going into quite a lot of detail for this one, and we will practice it. In a way, you are sort of doing a which, why, what, but you've just not got as much time. You can't spend all of your time doing that, but you've got to think, what instrument am I hearing, and then what exactly are they playing? And yes, going into as much detail as on the first beat of the bar, there's a pizzicato low note played by the lower strings. You can put that into a shorter sentence. You know me, I'm always waffling. You can say that more succinctly. Let's keep listening. Try and listen. If you didn't hear it, try and listen to that plum, chung, 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 plum, chung, chung, chung. See if you can hear it. Let's stop doing it now. Okay, so we've got the higher strings playing, so it's a bit high. We've got the higher strings playing, or you say upper strings, higher strings or upper strings, because it's violins. Probably that's too high for violas actually, but you're not sure, and you don't need to, you don't need to spell out every instrument. You can just say upper strings playing alternating notes, longer held notes, and it was the cellos that had a melody. So that's a really important point in the accompaniment. You hear the cellos playing a little melody, playing a little theme. Boom, 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 boom. We've now got Alberti bass. And then it ends. So there is a lot going on. We've got repeated chords played lightly. We've got then playing something that's more melodic in harmony with the soloist. We've then got repeated chords again, but this time we've got quite a clear pizzicato low note, and then the 3 repeated chords afterwards because it's 4 beats per bar. So plonk, chunk, chunk, chunk in that next section. Then what happened after that? Then we had that little bit of the upper strings playing the chromatic alternating 2 notes, and the cellos have a theme, have a little melody. And then I've forgotten what happened at the end. Let's listen to it all again and consolidate. Solo instrument, flute. Term for the phrasing. Right, well, that's classical. That is as balanced and classical as you can possibly get. And it's early classical as well, because that's quite a small orchestra. We've not really heard any instruments other than strings, but we've not heard a harpsichord. And that's very balanced. So a date, I'm going to pick an early classical date. So I'm going to say 1770. But if you put a date between 1750 and 1820, you would get the mark. Even though it's early classical, you would still get the mark. Well done to those of you that did put dates like 1770 or 1780, because I could tell you thought about it and you thought it's early. And then my classical composer, Mozart. Don't need to overthink it. You could put Haydn, that's fine. Haydn or Mozart. But yeah, I think that is written by Mozart, but it could have been Haydn, and Haydn is obviously slightly earlier than Mozart as well, so that's fine. Let's go back and listen to it again. But we want to just really focus on the accompaniment at all times. And you are going to, you did have this 3 times. So you can answer the other questions and then have at least 2 playings where you just focus on the accompaniment. You also only need to put 6 things down. So you're not going to have to describe absolutely all of it. You pick out what you can in the time. Here we go. So ready to listen to the repeated chords by the strings. Chunk, chunk, chunk. And that little bit where they play in harmony. Da, 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 da. Does it again. New section. Listen to that pizzicato beat on first beat of the bar. You hear that little cello theme? Oh no, it's Alberti bass at the end. Dun, 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 dun. Oh, that was it, wasn't it? It just faded out at the end. Okay, so that was my end thing. So you've got lots of options for that one. But I think generally the answers that I got back just weren't going into enough detail. So that is one that we are going to practice, and we will do more of those. But it's difficult as well with the accompaniment because it's less obvious, it's harder to hear, it's lower down, it's generally quieter because that's the purpose of an accompaniment. It's not at the forefront, it's in the background. So yeah, that was a tricky one. And that is the end of the questions.